If you enjoy this show, please share, rate, and review. The more listeners, the greater the impact. Chuck DeGroat is a follower of Jesus, a husband to Sarah for 30 years, and father to two amazing daughters. He serves as professor of counseling and Christian spirituality and as executive director of the clinical mental health counseling program at Western Theological Seminary. He's also faculty member of the Soul Care Institute. Chuck is a licensed therapist, spiritual director, author of 5 books, and retreat leader. We're excited to have him on about his new book, Healing What's Within, Coming Home to Yourself and to God When You're Weary, Wounded, and Wandering.
Boom goes a thunder, everybody goes a rain. Here I am, boom goes a thunder, look at me, I'm alright. Everybody goes a rain. In the storm, dancing to the rhythm of the rain.
Welcome home, where healing and restoration are celebrated in stories from those who have walked through fire and come out the other side. Welcome to the Pursuing Redemption podcast, with Heather Shore.
Dancing to the rhythm of the rain. Everybody goes a rain. Here I am, goes a thunder, look at me, I'm alright. Everybody goes a rain. In the storm, dancing to the rhythm of the rain.
Welcome to the show, Chuck. We're very excited to have you and talk about your new book and would love to dive into what you have to say today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We would love to hear a little bit about your story, how you came to Christ, and just this amazing journey that God's had you on.
Yeah, well, I've kind of a strange story in the sense that my parents weren't Christians, and but they thought it would be important for me to get baptized, and they took me to a church on Long Island, New York, where I grew up. I used to have a thick New York accent, by the way.
Okay.
Don't quite have that anymore, but it stuck. They stayed at that church, and it was a vibrant church, and so I grew up in the landscape of faith, and so that part of things was really rich and vibrant, and I've got lots of good stories to tell about that season of my life. But of course, as you get a little bit older, right, you get into college, you make it your own, and I went through the inevitable stumblings that one does in college before I said, yeah, Jesus, I think I want to actually follow you.
That's great. We all have those stumbling as part of our story, for sure. Would love to hear a little bit more about your professional journey, which you document in your new book, that really led to different parts of your story developing and how you've gone about your healing journey.
Yeah, so I started in ministry in the mid-1990s. I went to seminary into pastoral ministry in Orlando, later in San Francisco, California. In the middle of that, I got a PhD in psychology. I was also trained as a therapist. And so you start to hear, I've lived this sort of hybrid life, where I've done a number of different things. I started to write around when I turned 40 years old, and I've now published 6 books. And so I've sort of done this pastor, therapist, church planner and pastor assessor, church consultant, author, and I don't know which role fits me best. I think sometimes it all had to go away. I enjoy doing the counseling work a lot, but I've gotten to do a lot of really good things and to serve the church in a variety of different ways.
Mm-hmm. So maybe tell us a little bit about where you are right now with the seminary that you teach at and what sort of classes that you're leading.
Yeah, so I teach up in West Michigan at a seminary, a small seminary called Western Theological Seminary. And so right now it's about 25 degrees and snowflakes, lake effect snow is coming down, and it's very cold, and it'll be dark until about May. But I have been teaching pastoral care courses here, a course called The Christian Interior Life, courses in our clinical counseling program that I helped found here for the last 11 years or so. A variety of classes at the intersection of let's just say, psychology and Christian spirituality, which is really my wheelhouse. But a lot of that work around as you might sort of suspect with some of the books I've written, like When Narcissism Comes to Church, at the intersection of pastoral health, clergy health, and how we sustain in ministry.
Can you speak to a little bit about that journey with inner healing and wholeness? Because, like you referenced, you've written that other amazing book, When Narcissism
Yeah.
Comes to the Church, but now we're talking about
Yeah.
healing what's within.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's been probably the primary theme of my writings over the years, and the narcissism book might be the exception to that. But one of the things that I sensed with this new book was that in my story and in many people's stories, and I tell this story in the book, I was fired in 2003 from a church, and I'm really glad social media wasn't around during that time. I don't know what that would have been like or what I might have inflicted on people, but I was in a lot of pain. And I think a lot of us are working out our pain publicly today, particularly when it comes to matters of spiritual abuse. And I know for years I looked for people to sort of validate what had happened to me. And the reality is something really painful did happen to me, and I needed to take that seriously. But to do the deeper healing work, I had to turn within. I had to sort of shift my gaze to the trauma within. I often say abuse is what happens to you, or neglect, or other things. Trauma is what happens within you. And I had to turn my attention to, trauma is the Greek word for wound. I had to turn my attention to the wound that I was carrying within. And the reality is I was a pastor and therapist out in San Francisco, and I landed in the hospital. I tell that story pretty vulnerably. The book, The Body Keeps the Score. Like, my
It's a
body
great book.
kept the score.
Yeah.
And I landed in a Mexican hospital, my system septic, at 42 years old. And so my body was carrying all the undealt with pain. And the crazy thing is I was the one telling everyone else to do the work, but I was ignoring some of the work inside of me.
Yeah. How hard was it to turn sort of introspectively during that time? Or was it just God just brought you to your knees and it was like, all right, here we go. We're going to really face this.
Where God brings you to your knees,
Yeah.
right? Like, I think it would have been harder if it was just me on my own doing it. But I think when you're in a state of unhealth like I was, that God really does get your attention. And I do think that I was in an extended sort of like dark night of the soul for a number of years, where I was kind of wearing my religious clothing as a pastor, right? I was talking the talk, but
Yeah.
I was really struggling, and I was vulnerable with some close friends. But I mean, people didn't know the extent of my struggle, and so God really did bring me to my knees. And there was this sense that God wanted the whole of me. Like, I had been pushing really hard, and I had to do some work around exploring, like, how did I get here? Why was I telling others to enter into God's rest? But why was I living in such an exhausting and performative way? And that really became the journey of the next 5 years or so.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to delve into some of the questions in the book because they, as I read it, very much spoke to me. I'm personally in like a transition season. And so I loved the 3 questions that you asked. So maybe would you like to delve into that a little bit?
Yeah, this sort of became the frame for the book. And it's fun because, these are questions that I've been working with for a number of years. But of course, the more you work with them, the more they grow in you. And the questions that I really discovered in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and the 3rd chapter of Genesis, where, of course, Adam and Eve are hiding behind fig leaves, right? They're ashamed, they're overwhelmed. They hear God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. They think that God is angry with them, and so they hide from God. But God comes beginning with a very kind question: where are you? And I think that I grew up hearing that question as sort of an angry finger in your face. Where are you? What have you done? But my contention in the book, and these 3 questions from Genesis 3 are really the outline of the book, the first 3, the second 3 chapters, and the third 3 chapters of the book, that these are really kind, compassionate, and curious questions. And that God's "where are you" meets you and me wherever we are in our lives, in the midst of our stuckness or disconnection. Or there's so many. I've been doing this for a long time, right? So I've sat as a pastor, as a therapist, with a lot of folks, with a lot of Christians, with a lot of professional Christians, by the way, too. Pastors who've been doing it for a long, long time, and who will say, I'm not even sure I really believe this anymore. Like, I'm not sure that what I'm saying on Sunday mornings is really true. And so this question, where are you, is a question that meets us when so often we're asking God, where are you? what's comforting to me is that God is actually the one doing the pursuing, saying, no, I'm coming after you. I haven't stopped coming after you, and I'm continuing to come after you with kindness, with curiosity. I want to know where you are, how you're stuck, where you've gotten lost, sidetracked. Yeah. So that's the first question. I want to continue on with the others.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love all three. They're amazing.
Yeah. The second question I think is really curious as well. Who told you? Which is like a more probing question from God. Like whose voice have you been listening to? What story have you been listening to other than the story of worth, a belonging, a purpose that I whispered over your life? God makes us in God's image. And I say in the book that image is about God creating us in worth, in belonging, in purpose. And yet what the serpent whispers over us is a different story. It's a story that says, you can't trust God. And, can you really trust God's design for you? Maybe you are not enough. Maybe you're deficient. Maybe something's missing. There's some fruit on that tree. And, if you grasp that, you'll get that missing thing that you think you need. And I mean, I live that story. The thing about Genesis 3 is like, we're all living that story today, right? Like we're all living in that same story. And so the invitation is to go back and ask, like, what voices have I been listening to? Whose were the formative voices in my life? And I realized, at times it was my mom or dad, albeit like unwittingly, unintentionally whispering not enoughness over time. Like, you better get good grades. You better do better things for Jesus. That led to me, for years pushing so hard, The third question I think is interesting in that it's not as open-ended. It's, have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? And I sort of wondered, like, God, what are you asking in that question? And what I heard over time was, where have you taken your hunger and thirst? Like, in other words, where have you gone to satisfy yourself? I've been thinking about this over the course of, like, I don't know when this podcast will come out, but we're recording during the high holidays of Black Friday. And what do they call Saturday? Whatever Saturday is. Cyber Monday.
Cyber Mondays just happened yesterday.
All these high and holy days of the consumeristic year, right? The retail year. And it's in this season where it's like, oh, I need that. I want that. That'll make the pain go away. That'll help me feel less lonely. If only I have that thing, if only so even in this season, as I've been listening for that third question, where have you taken your hunger and thirst? I feel God saying, it's Advent. The invitation is to open your hands, to surrender, to let go, to wait, to long for so much more. You'll never find what you think you need in grasping, as Adam and Eve did, and as I do every day of my life.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to sort of that longing. And I loved one of the, and we'll talk about the stories in the book in just a second, but I loved one of the exercises at the end where it was like, just sit with the Lord and do this for 30 days and ask him, where are you taking your longings? Like, what do you long for?
Yeah.
And sort of see how he answers those questions for you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We don't sit with the longing, right? We satiate the longing in all sorts of ways. And it's so easy. I mean, I wake up in the morning and my phone is literally like right next to my bed, and so it's easy to pull that off the charger and to start scrolling. And then you're off to the races. And I think we ignore this deeper conversation that God wants to invite us to, where God is saying, I want to satisfy your hunger and thirst, your deepest longings. Yeah,
it's a great exercise. I encourage everyone to go do this. I started here at the beginning of December. I was like, all right, let's end the year well. Like, let's prepare for 2025 and do this. But one of the things I would love to talk about is just the story of Wendy that's in the book. I really loved hearing just her all shall be well that was born out of suffering. And maybe could you unpack a little bit about her story and how that came to be and what she really learned out of suffering? Because it was really beautiful. Yeah,
I mean, Wendy, all of my stories, by the way, are composites of stories.
Sure.
So that, that I, in the work that I do, the work is so personal, confidential, right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously,
absolutely.
But there's so many Wendy's that I've seen who whose journey have taken a lot longer than they expected. The first book that I wrote was about the Exodus story, and I said that it was a 40-day journey that should have taken 11 days. Literally could have taken 11 days. But that feels a lot like my life, your life. The journey is taking so long. And Wendy's was a story of experiencing some profound pain, some profound abuse in her life that turned toward her trying to work it out in her own way with a lot of control through a season of some pretty profound anger. A season that I got to sit with her for an extended period of time. But she didn't avoid it, and she really leaned in. And there are times, I think, in our stories where it feels like will this be my only reality? Feeling overwhelmed, feeling stuck, feeling angry, feeling enraged, feeling completely abandoned by God. I can't tell you how often I've sat with people, and in seasons that went on for a long time, where it felt like that's my only reality. And sometimes we're tempted to bypass these things. We call it spiritual bypassing, emotional bypassing, to put a pretty little bow on the top and to sort of make it go away, to ignore it. But Wendy hung in there and continued to do the work, continued to wrestle with God, so that when she said to me years later, "All shall be well," there was a deep sense that she had experienced a real kindness from God, in the sense that she'd been, so many of the Psalms do, they go to places of darkness. There's a wrestling with God, but oftentimes by the end of the Psalm, but your mercies will be new in the morning, or something like that, and the mercies were new in the morning for Wendy. And you could tell, there was that kind of seasoned, I remember even sitting with her and I could see it in her eyes, that kind of seasoned kind of look that she gave me as someone who had lived through the darkest valley, right, had come out the other side and had endured some significant suffering. Wasn't going to make light of it, wasn't going to bypass it, but had a deep sense that God had met her in that valley, and not in through her strategies for bypassing it.
What are some of the things that you would encourage people to do to not bypass that work? Because the work is really important.
Yeah. It's really important. If y'all have read the book, I start out by talking about how loneliness only magnifies a wound, the wound of trauma. It's really important to be seen and known in the midst of our suffering. And so many of us learned very early on in life that it was bad to be needy. So we learned to stuff our needs. And I know I continue to do this when I feel overwhelmed, when I feel exhausted. Well, I landed in the hospital because of this, right? But I tend to sort of stuff my needs. I'm okay. I'll be fine. I'm resilient. I'm strong. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think the invitation is for us to remember that we're human. And by definition, that means that we're needy. We can be overwhelmed at times, struggling, suffering, angry, sad, disappointed, all sorts of different things. And it's important to find people who will sit with us in that. It's important to find churches who will not minimize that. I know, in the first church that I served, I'll be honest, there was a sense of, we're gonna create a counseling center so that you can, put all your pain over there, because we really want our worship to be a joyous space. And I think sometimes, when I read the Bible, when I read like the Psalms, again, to go back to the Psalms, if those are the worship songs from back in the day, some of them are real downers, some of them are really dark. There's profound honesty. And I know that the people I work with long to find their way to church spaces where there can be honesty, where there can be lament, where they can raise voices of confusion before God, where they can, find their story in the words of honest, psalmists, narrators in Scripture who are speaking vulnerably before God. And so that's where it begins. It begins in relationships with people who are safe and who will hold your story. I think it's cultivated in churches where we can be honest and bring our whole selves.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that she found that at the end of the day. Yeah. Through all of her stuff. I would also love to delve into the story of Trey. Yeah. And I'm sure he's also a culmination of many people, but I would really love to understand, like, or maybe you speak to underneath how he really wanted to belong and be loved, but he had a porn addiction, and it's something
Yeah,
that's very common on both genders. And so
yeah.
really, how do you find that love and that true sense of belonging underneath all of these really deep wounds at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, I think it is going underneath, like you said, and there was this deep longing for belonging, to be seen, to be known, which is about as core as it gets, you know. And Trey took his deep longing to pornography because that was a place pretty early on in the midst of a childhood where he didn't feel seen or known, where he had some sense of the gaze of another, you know. I think we take these longings to social media. We look for it in a like. We look for it in, you know, a story that makes sense of our story in all sorts of different kinds of ways, right? I think his particular addiction, of course, um, you know, in a marriage and in the church, can really be damaging, right? And I don't want to minimize at all the impact of a pornography addiction, but he had worked for so long in spaces that were oriented more to behavior modification. Let's just make the behavior go away. Let's just get you to stop doing it. That was the focus. And as you might have read, the invitation in our work was for him to go a little bit deeper, to listen for that question that God asked: Who told you? What voices have you been listening to? Where is the wound? Um, and so I often say we don't begin with the problem, we begin with the wound underneath, and then the deeper longing. And what was stunning for Trey was that he began to sense that there was this deep longing that had been so secretive. He hadn't talked about it, right? He'd virtually been invulnerable in his relationships, that he began naming with the people who cared about him, not least his wife. And that was a really intense season because it felt really vulnerable. Like he learned to sort of satisfy his needs on his own, so to speak, right? And as he did that in his own vulnerability, his wife began to say, "Well, I don't look at pornography, but I have some of the same kinds of tendencies to take my own wounds, to satisfy and satiate my own wounds, and in my own scrolling and my own, you know, I scroll through and I look at the lives of women my age in their mid 30s and what they're doing and what they're experiencing, and I try to find some sense of meaning in my own life. I'm essentially doing something very, very similar." And so we really got to the heart of it, which is what I'm saying is the wound beneath the addiction, and then the deeper longing. He was finally able to say, with vulnerability, as a man who is taught not to have needs, I long to be seen, and there's such a deep wound around my sense of belonging, around my sense of being seen. There's such shame in my life that I need to put words to now.
Hmm. How did that end up working out for them? Out of curiosity, were they able to work through it and stay married?
Yeah, you know, I think that yeah, they were.
That's
In
amazing.
the particular case that I was thinking of, this sort of behind, there's maybe a primary story behind that particular story, and they were in large part because of his vulnerability, and because his wife gained empathy for him as she saw that this has less to do with the pornography and more to do with these deep wounds that he's trying to address. He was trying to address them in a number of different ways. Pornography was one piece. But then as she saw herself as a co-struggler, a co-sufferer, like, that was not to minimize how she had been wounded by him, you know, because there were years of him sort of disappearing, numbing, going off the emotional radar, you know, and she had to deal with, like, what's going on with you? And she had to deal, frankly, with his dishonesty. Like, it's stop asking me so many questions, you know, leave me alone. Um, and so, you know, they had stuff to work through. I don't want to minimize that at all. But as she began to see, you know, I have my own deep wounds that I'm addressing in my own ways as well. And maybe the two of us can meet one another as needy, wounded and needy people who are longing for the same things, but trying to address those longings and those wounds in ways that might actually be self-sabotaging.
Sure, sure. So, speaking of addictions, and I thought this was really, really good, especially in light of, I think, how God is really exposing what's going on in the
Mhm.
church. But you talked about like our cherished addictions. And one of them you brought up was religious addictions, how
Yeah.
we really get in there and that's how we feed
Mhm.
everything going on. What are, I guess, how do people really go about soothing this sort of
Yeah.
addiction? And how are we keeping that healing at bay
Yeah.
by getting into some of this stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes we can do it in the very things that were comforting to us at one point along the way. I think about people who I've worked with who um, are, we're avoiding some of the pain in their lives by even through their practices of doing devotions in the morning or listening to worship music or things that aren't bad, right? But were ways of kind of avoiding. And in church history, there's a woman named Saint Teresa of Avila. She lived in the 16th century. I'm a big fan of Saint Teresa and some of these women mystics throughout church history. And the women always get it right in the way the men don't. But she talks about these consolations that you have early in your Christian journey that you go back to. And, like the book that you read when you were a new Christian, it was like, oh, that's the book. And I got to go by whatever it is, the purpose-driven life or whatever. I pick one random. And then you go back and it doesn't land in the way it landed before. It lands with a thud. And there's some sense of God, are you not speaking anymore? Have you disappeared? And it's oftentimes in our spiritual busyness that God exposes the futility of these sort of older ways that we got our needs met and invites us to more. But it means that we have to put some of these things down, recognizing that they were for a season. Perhaps it was that way of engaging God. Like I've done spiritual direction with people who did a lot of reading and praying out loud early on in their Christian life. And now in their middle-age years or later age years, there's a lot of silence. And it's like, I wake up in the morning and I crave silence. It used to be that I'd read 60 pages of a Christian book and, pray very specifically for all the members of my family. But now I feel the Lord just calling me to spaces of silence and a recognition of my own needs and the needs of the world. And so God wants to transform us, even through exposing some of these things that were consolations and comforts early on, but which we go to for maybe soothing later, but don't work in the same way.
Mm-hmm. It's just so incredibly good. And it's interesting to watch people sort of walk through that journey as well.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to hear a little bit about maybe how you pair deliverance with healing.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I mean, deliverance, I don't do that work, but I work alongside people who do that kind of work. And I think in the big sort of Venn diagram of the work, for me as a therapist primarily, I'd say that it's really important not to fall into like an either or, which is to say, reject deliverance because only therapy works because it's contemporary and we have all of our new ways of engaging science, and or engage deliverance because that's just psychobabble. But how do we partner together, right? And over the years, I've been able to work really closely with spiritual directors, pastors, even priests who have been engaged in deliverance ministry. I always like to work with the ones who are not looking to engage quick fixes, who don't see the Holy Spirit as, like a holy microwave that, speeds your pain away, but sees deliverance as one part of the deeper work of transformation. Like I know people who have experienced some sort of deliverance from some sort of bondage that has allowed them to experience a freedom from, let's say, pornography or overeating or whatever the case may be, but who have realized, oh, that was only one piece of a much larger journey of transformation. And so it wasn't like well, that was it on October 5th, 1998, done, I'm there, I'm perfected, I'm transformed, but it's one piece of a larger unfolding of our journey of sanctification and transformation in our lives.
Mm-hmm. That was a very, very good answer. I liked it. If you could really encourage somebody to chase after Jesus, in the midst of all these, strategies and
Mhm.
things with the Lord, what would you say?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so much of it for me nowadays is simplifying things for folks. I mean, we've made chasing after Jesus or relationship with Jesus so complicated, it seems, and it comes with all sorts of accoutrements, you know. And so oftentimes I'm asking people, like, what do you need to put down in order to find your way back to that, let's just say, childlike um, uh, wonder and awe in the face of Jesus, and Jesus's kindness and compassion to you. And when people start to name the things that they've picked up, and that we were just talking about this a moment ago, the kinds of religious addictions that overwhelm us, and as they think about how cluttered their faith has become and so complicated. I remember a woman that I was working with who took a picture of a stack of books, and she's like, "This is what my faith has become. Is like, if I get through these stack of books, I'll be there." And so she set aside those books. She put them in a closet, and she began to sit in silence. And it was very uncomfortable. I mean, it was very, to wake up in the morning and not have something in her hands, a workbook, a Bible, but she just began listening for the kind voice of Jesus. And we obviously there's more to it than that, right? But she began hearing God's kindness. And what was interesting is we were working with these questions of Genesis chapter 3 that I work with in my book. Where are you? Who told you? Where have you taken your hunger and thirst? And she began hearing God gently and kindly ask her those questions every morning. And she's like, I didn't realize, but I could go back to those books, but like scripture is in me. God's voice is in me. The Spirit is in me. And so I can listen in a way that I can trust that the Spirit will show up, that God will meet me wherever I am.
That's so good. So if people could find you, where can they find you? Online?
Yeah.
Or maybe visit you in your classes where
Yeah,
you
or
teach all the
you may
things.
not want to come up to West Michigan until May, but
Yeah.
yeah, I can be found online. My website is chuckdegroat.net. I'm on the various social media spaces, but I try to do that a little bit less during Advent, where I try to practice what I preach and open my hands a bit. If anyone wants to come up and visit Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, and sit in on one of the classes, you're welcome to do that. Just bring your snow boots in the next few months.
Awesome. And all of your books can be found on Amazon, which I highly recommend you go find.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Chuck, thank you so much for coming on today. We've really enjoyed this. We appreciate it. And we look forward to what God has for you in 2025.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Appreciate it.
Thank you.